Hello, my name is Daniel Valencia, and today I will be explaining the installation, maintenance, and deployment process of the VAS application. So by now you guys should have the VAS folder, which houses both the client and server folders of our application. Um, you're gonna need an IDE or a text editor to edit the code. I recommend using Visual Studio Code, which is what I used for the development of this project. If you do not have Visual Studio Code and you want to get it, you can find it on code.visualstudio.com and download it for whatever platform you need. And secondly, you would also need Node.js, which you can find on nodejs.org/en/. You're going to want to go ahead and download the most recent LTS version. And once you have that, assuming you're going to be using Visual Studio Code, we will open Visual Studio Code, open up the folder, we will see the project. You will also want to open a terminal. You can do this both on Mac and Windows. And we're going to want to check that installing Node also installed npm along with it. We'll check the version of Node to make sure that Node is on there. And then we will check the version of npm by doing npm/b, and that will give us the version of npm, so we know that we have that installed as well. Next, we're going to want to navigate to the client. And when we're in the client folder, we're going to want to run the command npmi to install all the dependencies that we have in the client. This is going to take a little bit, especially since you guys, this is the first time you guys are running the project. And once that is done, you're going to want to navigate to the server and do the same. Run the command npmi. Now, once you have all the dependencies installed, we're going to want to run the server, and we do this by, in the server file, running the command npm run dev. This will start our server, our development server, and connect to the database. Once we've done that, we're going to want to open up a new terminal using the plus button over here, and we're going to want to navigate to the client folder. And then in the client folder, we're going to want to run the command npm start. This will build our project and open up a new browser tab with the application's homepage. By default, React will host the application on your localhost port 3000. And once that is loaded, we will have successfully installed and have our application running locally. I highly recommend that you guys install, if you're using Chrome, a tool called Redux DevTools. You can go ahead and install that. And when you do, you'll be able to access it using the More Tools, Developer Tools on your browser. You'll have Redux. So this is the Redux Dev tool, which I highly recommend. This is what we used throughout our development process to see how our application was maintaining state throughout the process. So I'll sign in using a administrator account that we have signed in. We have registered in the database, which is lopez@admin.com, and the password is just lowercase pass, PASS. We'll log in, and you'll see the actions and the states being set as you navigate through the application, and it comes in very much handy when you're developing. Helps throughout the debugging process. Now I'm going to want to try and give a simplified explanation of our application's folder structure. As you can see here, you have the client and server folders. I will walk through the server folder first. Now, in the server file folder, you'll see that the main file, server.js, we are using Express, the web framework, for our application. And here you'll see we call in the API, which our folder is here. I'll explain that a little bit later. Once we start up the server, the application will log into the database. That's what this block of code does here. And it will log into the database depending on the information stored in the .env file. This is the credentials to the development database we have. You'll see this is my account, and we use it for development purposes. So the application will connect to the database using that information, and then through the API on our server, our index, you'll see all of the endpoints that we have in our API. We have the account, volunteers, admin, school personnel, school, and the team endpoints. Each of them you can see is extended. For example, volunteers, the volunteers endpoint, you have the update volunteer, you have fetch volunteers by PID, and the functions in relation to the endpoint. So when that endpoint is accessed, this is the function that will run. And another thing would be the models folder. In the models folder is the schema of our database. This is required by Mongoose, which is the driver that we use to communicate with MongoDB. As you can see, the database schema here, school has an attribute school name with a type string, and a school code attribute with a type string. And this is how we maintain the structure of our database. That is pretty much the most important when it comes to the server. And now touch base on the client. For the client side, we have inside the source folder, we have our application structured with pages and components. The entry point into the application is app.js, and in app.js you can see all of the endpoints that we have on the website. So we have the /login, /dashboard, /volunteer management. And that, as you can see, is if you were to access that endpoint in the client, it'll take you to that page. Now, in the pages folder, you will see all the pages that we have housed on the website. And right now I'm on volunteer management page. And as you can see on the volunteer management page, the volunteer management page calls on the volunteer table component. And this is kind of how we have the folder structured throughout the application. We have the pages, and then in the components folder, we have the components that the pages render. Now, the volunteer table component would be inside of the components folder, and we had that structured mostly with what it's more related to. So volunteer table would be related to volunteers. The volunteer table is related to volunteers. So under volunteers, you'll see volunteer table. This component is what this table is rendered. So on this table, you can see that we have add volunteer action and an edit volunteer action. They open up dialogues. So if I were to click edit volunteer, you'll get an edit volunteer dialog. If I were to open add volunteer, you'll get an add volunteer dialog. These dialogues are components, which are also found under the volunteers in the components as add volunteer dialog and edit volunteer dialog. And as you can see, that's pretty much how we have most of the application structured, since most of the functionality is managing users. So you have team management, school personnel management, school management, even the admin management, and they all have their respective adding, editing, school, adding and editing dialogues. So that's pretty much how the pages and components are structured together. Now, since we did use Redux in our application, Redux calls for actions and reducers, which is what these folders are here. You're gonna have to research Redux on your own because it's pretty hard to explain all in a simplified manner. In actions, you'll find all the actions that we call to the server, and Redux acts as a middleman, and it helps us either capture state and keep state in our application so that we can manipulate data throughout the application. So for example, if you wanted to edit a volunteer's information, in the edit dialog form, once you click send, you're going to call a function inside of volunteer actions, which would be edit volunteer. And this action is going to take the volunteer's ID and the form that is being submitted, and it's going to send a request to this endpoint here. All of our endpoints we have structured in the config file. And in the config file, you'll see our endpoints here. You have the endpoints for the account, for the administrators, for the volunteers. You have the endpoints for signing up, fetching, updating, and the endpoints are being sent to the HTTP localhost 4000 API, which is where we're running the server. So this is how the client will communicate with the server. Something else that I highly recommend is MongoDB Compass. This really helps to view your database. It's like visually appealing, and it helped us through our development process with MongoDB Compass. You just connect using the MongoDB URI, which is this up to here, and you can also find that on the application, because it is also what is used in the server to connect to the database in the .env file. It's the username, the password, the URL, and the table. That's the string you would use to connect to the database and be able to get a nice visual of the data. Since we have the application hosted on FIU server, you either need to, if you're on Windows, get an SFTP program, or if you're on Mac, you can just use your terminal. And in your terminal, you guys won't have access to this until Christy speaks with the network administrators for them to grant you access into the server. But when you do, I'll give you an overview because this is where we have it deployed. I'll show you how this works. So it's cs first.cis.fiu.edu, and then Not found. Cool. I got SSH. SSH. And then put in my password. And now that we're in here, I'm going to become super user. Now we are root, and we are going to go to the root of the server. Now in the root, you will see a folder called var. We're going to want to go into var. And then in var, you will see a folder called www. You want to go into www. Here is where the only changes for any deployment, that's where it needs to be done. This is the only spot we really make any changes. So on this FIU server, we also are hosting a Mongo database. So there's a couple of changes that need to be made to the code before it can successfully run on this server. As you can see, we have the VAS application folder here. When you are done making your changes and ready to deploy, you will replace this folder with the folder you guys have. But the changes that you're going to want to do are, you're going to want to go into the folder on the server. In the .env file that holds the database information, since now we're going to want to use a database that's hosted on the FIU server, it's no longer going to be the credentials that were for the deployment. So I'm going to make some changes to that .env file. I'm going to use Vim. You can use any text editor of your choice. Vim.env. As you can see, the one on the server has a different credentials, and this is because we're using the Mongo database on the server, not the one that's hosted outside of the server. But this is the information you're going to want to change this .env file to, so that it is communicating with the database properly. After you've made that change, you're going to want to go into the client and in the client, in the source folder of the client, you're going to want to make changes to the config file. So I will open up the config file, config.js. And in here, you'll notice that the URI is different than the URI that we have in the development. This is because we want the client to communicate with the server that we have running on this FIU server. So you need to change the URI to this. Once you have that change made, you're going to want to, let's clear this. Go into your client folder, and in the client folder, you are going to want to run the script npm run -script build. Now, when you run that, it's going to build your React app for deployment. We already have this done, so I'm not going to run this, but you're going to have to run this. And when you're done running this, your client will have a folder called build. Now, because of the way this server is set up, in the www root folder, the server is only serving what is inside of the HTML file. So let me explain. If I go to cd, go back to the www folder, you'll see this HTML folder. In this HTML folder, there is the index.html. That index.html is what is being accessed when you go on the browser. So this is the development. When you go on the browser and you access cs-first.cs.fiu.edu, that index file is what's being served. So we need to go into the client, and that build folder, if you notice, if I go into the build folder, its contents are the exact same as the contents in the HTML folder. This is because we have to move the build folder from outside of the client into the www folder and then rename that folder HTML. I know it's confusing, but you need to go into the VAS folder, go into the client, and then here you have to run the command mv, which is move, build, and then you would do whatever the www, which would be 1 back, 2 back, that'll take us to VAS, and W. So this is the command you would run. Once you run that command, then you will have build here with HTML and VAS. Now what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to rename build to HTML and then get rid of this old HTML file. So the HTML file is actually the build file, just renamed only because this is the only way that the server will display the run the application is inside of the HTML, the index.html. That is the file that the server is looking for when you access cs first.cs.fiu.edu. Now, on the FIU server, we use a process manager called PM2 to keep our server running. So once you make these changes and you have your new VAS folder and you moved your build to HTML and renamed to HTML and made those changes accordingly, then you have to go into the server folder, and in the server folder you must run pm2 start server.js. When you do that, it'll start your server and keep it running. So this is how you make changes. This is how you move your changes from development to deployment. So I've tried explaining the folder structure for our application as easily as I could. I know it's confusing at first, but I definitely recommend watching MERN stack tutorials and Redux tutorials if you're not familiar with the MERN stack. And that concludes this user guide video. Thank you for watching.